Spoiler alert, I actually liked this movie. Hello and welcome to Not So Super Movie Reviews. My name is Kenny and today we'll be talking about the movie Venom. Alright, so we only review movies on this channel that are superhero movies or based on comics that have a Rotten Tomatoes score of 65% or less. This movie has a critic score of 29% and a user score of 81%. I have to say that definitely that is the largest gap we've seen so far. We'll get into my opinions about that, but I think it definitely says something about the nature of the average viewer and the critic. So because I actually did like this movie, I want to switch up the formula just a little bit, and I want to start by talking about what didn't work. It just doesn't feel honest to talk about what didn't work last when I actually liked the movie. Alright, so the first thing that doesn't work is a little bit obvious, but it's the lack of Spider-Man. Regardless of how you feel about Venom as a character, at the end of the day, he's a Spider-Man villain. He turns into much more than that later on. There's some really good story arcs that he goes on his own, but for the most part, we all know him as a Spider-Man villain. And because of the deal with Sony and MCU, there's really no good way they could have brought in Spider-Man. You can't not have Tom Holland in the age of Tom Holland's Spider-Man. Whatever actor would have been doomed to play that role would have just not lived up to it, I'm sure. So I think they made a good choice by not trying to do a different Spider-Man in this movie. But the lack of Spider-Man and the rest of the Spider-Man mythos around this is definitely noticeable. And as a comic book reader, you do have to you do recognize that. Now, that's not to say that they didn't do a good job portraying Venom. I actually do feel like they captured his essence for the most part. Not a super serious, sort of wisecracking, goofball symbiote, which this movie definitely gets that. The second issue I have with the movie is the motivations of some of the key characters. Two in particular that really bugged me. First is this generic evil villain. Okay, he's literally he's your classic head of a corporation, so he's evil. It's very one-dimensional, and at times it doesn't even make sense. I mean, the whole concept is that he's going out into space to look for a new Earth because we're destroying this one, sort of like an Elon Musk, but evil, and they find these aliens, he brings them back, he's using human trials and just killing humans, but who cares because I'm the big bad guy. And then, he knows that these aliens' motivation is to destroy Earth, and he still decides to help them. It's super weird. Like, you don't really know what his motivation is other than he's the bad guy, so deal with it. The other character motivations that didn't make sense was Venom's. The whole point of their race is to come to different planets, eat everyone, and then go find another planet to destroy and eat. And so Venom is one of those aliens. He's looking to eat. And in the movie, he just sort of says, you know what? I'm kind of a loser just like you, Eddie Brock. I'm going to stop my alien race from coming here. So essentially, I'm going to doom all my entire race just on a whim. And the third thing that didn't work about this movie is that it is your very, very typical cookie-cutter superhero origin story. I mean, it follows the hero's origin to a T. Even though he's supposed to be an anti-hero, other than the fact that he kills people, his whole arc is your typical origin story. The bad guy is just a stronger version of him with the same powers. Eddie Brock starts off, he's got everything, then he loses everything, then he gets this power, he rejects it at first, then something happens that makes him accept it. And now that he's accepted it, he's got to save the world against unbelievable odds. Yeah, I mean, I just named the plot of however many movies and comic books. And this movie follows that formula like down to the letter. So I have to say that's a detriment. I think they did a pretty good job of it, but it is definitely your cookie cutter origin story. All right, so let's talk about what worked. First thing that comes to mind is the special effects. Across the board, special effects are solid, but you have to talk about the big one, which is the symbiotes, the different types of symbiotes, but especially Venom. From a character design perspective, he looks great. I mean, he doesn't have like the little symbol on his chest, spider-looking symbol. Other than that, it looks just like Venom, and it doesn't look stupid. It looks believable, and it looks pretty badass. And the whole effects that they do, which they do a lot of with the symbiote kind of doing its thing, is always really good. In particular, there's one scene at the very end of the movie when the final fight against Venom and I think Riot, the other big symbiote, and they're sort of coming apart from their hosts, and the hosts are punching each other, and it's really just a beautiful CGI scene. They spared no expense when it came to the CGI, and it pays off in spades. The second thing you have to talk about here is good casting, but also good character writing. Some of the motivations for some of the other characters weren't great, but I thought that Eddie Brock, they nailed it with Tom Hardy. He just makes the Venom role. He makes an amazing Eddie Brock. You believe him as the sort of hardened journalist. He's not exactly like Eddie Brock from the comics, but he's a far cry closer than Topher Grace was. And he just fits that role much better than he's fit, like he fit Bane. I would go probably as far as to say that, Ryan Reynolds is to Deadpool as what Eddie Brock is to Venom. If I see another Venom that's not Tom Hardy, I'll be disappointed. They totally nailed it, and the interactions between him and Venom, and the both of them with other characters, the love interest is not annoying. She's fine. Her boyfriend, the scientist that helped them out. Basically, every other character in this movie is just does a really good job. The casting's great, and you like them. That they're likable. A lot of the time, I have to say, when I say the casting is good, that's usually one of my good points out of many bad points. But it actually is a little bit refreshing to come here and say that the casting was good and the movie was good. So that was a nice change of pace. The final thing I liked about this movie was just that it's entertaining. At the end of the day, that's the point of a movie, especially a superhero movie, is just that it entertains you. This movie just doesn't have a lot of the factors that make a bad superhero movie bad. And now that I've spent, a couple months now analyzing a few really bad superhero movies, when I sat down to watch this one, I'm just not seeing a lot of that stuff. There's not a lot of cringy moments or terrible lines or confusing directions or choppy storytelling. It's a really solid, albeit formulaic movie, but it does that formula pretty well. If they made a really good sequel, this could be a great trilogy or even extended universe if they kind of up the quality. This would not be a dark spot. It'd be actually a pretty humble beginning to a good series. So yeah, at the end of the day, I recommend you watch this movie. I enjoyed it. Alright, so before we get into my final score, we have to talk about the hardest moment to watch, which I almost didn't have a moment. I got most of the way through the movie, and I was thinking to myself, this movie might not have one. I don't want to just pick one. But then one scene came along that I thought might be worthy of this segment. So there's a scene, it's a kissing scene, just like the Hellboy scene that we mentioned. Unfortunately, he's not kissing Baba Yaga, but one day. Brock gets separated from the symbiote. He gets captured without the symbiote. And so Venom, my apologies. So Venom attaches itself to his ex-girlfriend, and she turns into, she-Venom, or whatever they call her. And she finds Eddie, and to transfer the symbiote back to Eddie, they kiss. And so, you know, you got your typical kiss, you got your French kiss, and then you've got your disgusting alien symbiote kiss, which is like, that's like home base for sure. But it's just, it's not particularly graphic, it's just weird. And what makes it worse is that they mention it again later in the movie as if both of them kind of enjoyed it. Like, the ex-girlfriend and Eddie were kind of like, ooh, that kiss was something. Was it? I don't know if it was, but they certainly thought so. And then Venom kind of makes it seem like he's being the wingman and that he did that on purpose, which totally, I'm sure that's the point. But yeah, that's, if I had to pick a hard to watch moment, that's definitely the one. All right, so who do I agree with? The critics or the users? I think we already know the answer to that. It's the users, by a mile. The fact that the critic score is so low, it makes you wonder. It makes you think about the role of a critic. How many of these critics were just ready to hate on a Sony SpiderMan movie because they thought that's what the users wanted? You know, you have Spider-Man 3, The Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2, 2 certainly bad, but neither were that well received. So Sony has a bad history, and they're making this movie right in the prime of the MCU movies. So it's kind of like what happens to some of these DC movies too, where the critics kind of give it hell because they know that's what people want to hear. Now, I'm not saying all critics are like that, but there's some kind of evidence here. Another movie I felt this way about was Dark Phoenix. Now, it wasn't as good as Venom, but it wasn't as bad as the critics said. And that was another movie that the critics were ready to hate. So I think there are definitely some critics that take things objectively, but I think for the most part, when you're looking at that critic score, the critics are just trying to say what they think you want to hear. I love the MCU. I'm a huge proponent of what they're doing over there. It really sparked my love for superhero movies and comics to like a whole new level when I really got into the MCU after a few first movies. So I really appreciate the MCU, but there's actually a couple of MCU films that I prefer this movie over, which Thor 2, I wasn't a big fan of Ant-Man, but yeah, so this movie does not deserve what the critics gave it, and I definitely agree with the users. It's not the best movie in the world, but it's good. I had fun, I was entertained, and like I said, I would love to see more from this series. Alright, so now it's time for the bad line sneaking around. It was kind of hard with this movie because, like I said, I liked it. But just because I liked it didn't mean there weren't some cringy lines or some attempts at jokes that didn't necessarily land. So I did find a couple of gems. Science never sleeps.
So many snacks, so little time.
Told you I could fight ugly.
Like a dirt in the wind.
Alright, so that one actually made me laugh, but it is stupid. Alright guys, that pretty much wraps this one up. Thank you for watching. Hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. If you want to get notifications, hit the notifications button. I'll be doing these every week, so check me out. Here you'll see a link to last week's video, which was on the movie Hellboy. This one I did not enjoy. Spoiler alert. So yeah, check that out, and yeah, we'll see you in a week.